Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our latest webinar session, Is Open Source Ready for You? I am Chris Fernandez, and I'm your account manager. My contact information is right in front of you, the center of the screen. And now I'd like to introduce the president of New ID Engineering, Miles Kehoe, who will lead you through today's webinar.
Good morning. Thanks, Chris. Miles Kehoe here. For those of you who are joining us, I want to apologize. Mark Bennett was going to join us on the talk today. He's my business partner and co-founder, but something's come up that's got him busy. He's on a project that's going to make him unavailable today, so we will get him back on these webinars one of these months. I appreciate you joining us today. I want to quickly look at the agenda. What we're going to talk about is sort of introductions and the objectives of what we want to do, an overview of the open source market now, an overview of what open source means, and not just the question of are you ready for open source, but is open source ready for you. We'll talk about the business of open source, who's doing open source, where can you get it, what's going on with the different vendors, different tools and suppliers, and then some key takeaways for those of you who are either just starting an open source project or considering one, or even if you're in the middle of one. I would invite you, by the way, if you have any questions, you'll see over on the control panel there, you can type questions in there. We will be taking questions at the end. If there's a problem, please send a note there, and Chris will try to take care of that during the conference. Otherwise, we'll take questions at the end, and let's get started. Briefly, who we are. Many of you, I see a lot of familiar names there, people we've known before and have had business with before. Real quickly, we've basically been in business pushing 16 years now. We started with the two of us, Mark Bennett and I, leaving Verity to start the company. We figured would help companies get Verity working until we figured out what we wanted to do, and quickly found out that there was a business in helping people who bought search technology figure out which search technology to use, how to evaluate it, how to run it, and then how to implement it. And we've been doing that ever since. We've always had a vendor-neutral approach. We're far more likely to want to help you with projects based on your requirements than the requirements of a particular company or companies that we represent. So we work pretty much with all the commercial products, and we're actually quite active in open source as well. Not only, I guess we've been doing open source search now for about, oh gosh, it seems like 7 or 8 years. We started on our first solar project quite a long time ago, and we've been doing quite a bit. In fact, that's where Mark is today, working on a project that he couldn't get away from. We basically built a business out of being search analysts, developers, consultants, and authors. We co-authored the book you see there, Professional Microsoft Search, which was first pass at Fast Search for SharePoint and Fast ESP in the Microsoft environment. We blog pretty actively at enterprisesearchblog.com, and we do a number of presentations. I just got back from Enterprise Search Summit last week, and in fact, we're going to be doing a workshop at the October show back in Washington, D.C. By the way, one quick tidbit for you. About an hour ago, we saw the news that Mike Lynch, who is the founder of Autonomy, has been given his walking papers by HP. So HP is going to integrate Autonomy more tightly into their project. Be one more thing that's more interesting about commercial search, perhaps, but we'll be going from there. All right, Walter Underwood, who was one of the founders, certainly one of the early engineers of UltraSeek, which was sort of a great little search engine that could back in its day. He's been at UltraSeek, HP before then when I first met him. Also was at Netflix when they did their contest to try to figure out relevance. He's quite a fan of open source search. It turns out his wife works at a company here in the Bay Area that was using Fast ESP at the time. And not long after that, someone asked Walter what the difference is between open source search and commercial search. And this is his answer. With commercial search, you spend a lot of money to license it, then spend a lot of money to customize it. With open source search, you download it for free, then you spend a lot of money to customize it. So his take was that they're equivalent. I'm not quite sure that I'd agree that they're equivalent in all environments, but that's one way to look at it, and would invite you to consider the alternative. Walter's a pretty bright guy and knows quite a bit about search. So first I want to dive into the myths of commercial and open source search. The first myth of commercial search platforms, these things that vendors would love to have you believe, is that it's just going to run perfectly right out of the box. It's a piece of cake. If you think about it, if you look at an Oracle database is not a payroll system or an expert finder or an e-commerce system. In the same way, search, when you acquire it, it's a general purpose platform. A lot of the vendors have decided to position their product for specific vertical. For example, when I think of e-discovery, I think of Autonomy or Recommend, but those are actually general-purpose search engines where some special tools have been put in for the specific environment. For example, Indeca, another one, an e-commerce platform, but it's also a great search engine. But some programming is expected. Some small matter of programming, you're going to have to do some work to get even the most vertical of commercial search platforms ready. A lot of people think, gosh, if it's a commercial product, all the code that needs to be written has been written, and in fact, it really isn't the case. A lot of times, you need to do a lot of custom code. Some of it on the UI side, but even some on the indexing side. In fact, this is a side that a lot of companies don't see when they're going in. That a lot of times, it's not enough just to have the spider crawl your site and expect it to work. In fact, my workshop in New York last week was about how you can do a lot of pre-cooking, a lot of pre-tuning, and fixing up not only the content but the queries before the search engine gets it. So you don't think you need to go into commercial. You will get to go into the commercial soft platforms with no coding required. A lot of people say, hey, commercial search got to be much easier to implement. It's install it and run it. It's not like it's Microsoft Word or even Microsoft Access. It's a toolkit, and it's going to take some work to do. Developers can hopefully focus on higher level problems with commercial search. For example, how to balance distributed search versus needing to write some low-level parts for distributed search. But it's still, there's some work going to have to be done there. One of the myths is it runs on fewer servers and it's much more scalable. Well, in fact, I think that's actually a myth that we can probably bust. There are some platforms that require a lot of servers just to get a little bit of work done. And to scale well, it takes a lot of systems. Now, some companies like Fast, before the Microsoft acquisition, they were probably the people who knew best what scalability was. They could say, given this number of queries and this number of documents, this is the number of machines you need. You can still do that with Fast Search for SharePoint, but more of the vendors are more likely to say, well, just try it, or companies like yours have found this number of servers. And it's hard to get an exact estimate before you go in how many servers you need. So in that sense, I don't think we can really say that commercial search is more scalable or can run on fewer servers. It takes less supervision after deployment. This is the real myth that everyone believes and is actually not appropriate anywhere. One of the things, if you've heard any of our other webinars, or if you've heard me speak at different conferences, one of the things I'll say repeatedly is the difference between what Google does and what companies do is totally different. It's the monitoring, the watching the search engine, the tuning the search engine every day that makes the search engine successful. That's why Google and Bing are pretty darn good on the web, and that's why no matter what search engine you deploy inside your organization, it's probably not going to be as good as it should be. I was lamenting at Enterprise Search last week for one of our, with a guy who's in charge of search at a very large company, guy we worked with before, who said it's really sort of sad. Companies will buy a search engine for a lot of money, maybe $400,000, $500,000, $600,000, let it run for 4 years. Everyone's unhappy with it. A new manager will come in, take over, rather than try to fix it, because it can be fixed, they'll buy a new search engine and do the same thing. So that's one of the reasons search vendors love it, because, in fact, there's a good chance you're using a competitor now. In 3 or 4 years, I can get you to buy ours. But if you maintain it and you fix it, you can get the search engine really well. We've said in other webinars that after a certain level of functionality, some minimum level of functionality, you can make any search engine work like Google, but it takes time and effort, and that's the place that companies don't see that they need to invest. Does commercial search provide better tools in reporting? Well, they certainly have a lot of tools for the bare bones things. They for indexing. They'll have a search form, typically a generic search form. The reporting is still a weak point. 10 years ago, nobody was doing search reporting. Now there are a few companies that have some limited search reporting, but most of them don't have the real fine-tuning. I think I'd have to put in there an exception for Indeca, because people who are in e-commerce need to know minute to minute, second to second, what people are searching for and be able to put in best bets or re-ranking relevance based on new factors. Maybe the price has changed, or maybe I've got a discount from Canon if I can put their cameras ahead of any other cameras for a period of time. So the e-commerce tools are way ahead of the rest of us in commercial search for better tools for reporting, I think. Handle security more thoroughly. Well, actually, enterprise search, commercial search does probably handle security pretty well now. There's two types of security involved. There's what we call early binding security, which means the security credentials get indexed when we index the document, so we know what groups or what people have access to the document. So then at runtime or at late binding, we can actually filter it before we have to make any decisions. And it's a funny story there about, gosh, I don't know, we might have been one of the first companies to be writing about security and search. We submitted a paper to Enterprise Search probably in 2004, 2005 on the security implementations of Enterprise Search. And Jane Dysart, who runs the show, called me up. She said, do people really care about security in search? We said, yeah, actually we do. Trust us on this one. And since then, we've found it's become a hot item for a lot of people. We're pretty proud, actually. I was having lunch with Leslie Owens of Forrester about a year or two back, and Mark was there with me in Boston, and she said something about early binding versus late binding security. And Mark said, yeah, we came up with that phrase. She says, yeah, I know, we're copying your phrase. And boy, when Mark said, we just swelled right up incredibly. It's nice to know that Forrester and their analysts are using our terminology. It's usually the other way around. Fortunately, they let us use their terminology for free, so there's no question about them using ours. Okay, here's a myth that any problems you find will be fixed by the vendor. So there's some chance if you find a critical fix, a critical problem, the vendor will fix it, but there's a good chance that they're going to ask you to try a workaround or do some of the workaround. They're not going to change their release schedule for a problem that you find, no matter how severe it is. The hope is that if you find a severe problem, lots of other people have too, and they're going to fix the problem. But one of the problems here is that they're going to ask you to help them isolate it, help them identify it. So you're going to spend some serious time just trying to isolate the problem. We had a company using Google Search Appliance who were seeing some network traffic issues, and Google said, nope, not our problem. And after they spent about 6 months and a lot of network analyzers and packet analyzers and traffic, they were able to go back to Google and say, here is the problem. It's caused by you. At that point, Google acknowledged it, and they're working on a fix. But just because you bought the software doesn't mean they're going to fix bugs that you find. Supports more document formats. Well, there are a whole bunch of document formats out there, and in fact, if you go to your file shares, you might be amazed the ones you find. You might find some old, for all I know, you'll find some WordStar documents out there if you go far enough back. And the commercial platforms have done a pretty good job of supporting a wide range of document formats. Of course, Oracle has acquired Celent, which was one source of document formats, and Autonomy. Now HP had been the acquirer of one of the other suppliers of doc formats. So while there are some independent ones out there and some open source ones, you probably get a little bit better in terms of the platform filtering with commercial products. All right. And then the question is, commercial products are a safer bet. That's a real hot item. That's, if you talk to people who bought Fast ESP 5 or 6 years ago, who are now replacing it because Microsoft acquired Fast, and now they don't support it anymore. They're not even making the product. It's hard to say that Fast was a safer search back then, safer bet way back then. So I know a lot of companies say, geez, we really don't want to use open source because we really don't like all those guys with the funny haircuts and whatnot. But it really is kind of a myth that commercial search is a better or safer bet than open source, because you never know what's going to happen to the company you're working with. So let's go on to the next sentence, the myths of open source search platforms. Open source is enterprise ready. Oh, this is a hot one. Is open source enterprise ready? Well, open source search is probably enterprise ready. The search that you get in Lucene Solar or from any of the other open source is probably pretty darn good. You're going to have to do some relevance tuning. You're going to have to do some monitoring of that, of course. But the search itself is pretty good. But search is more than just search. An enterprise search platform is more than search. It's the crawler, it's the security, it's the reporting, all the things come after the fact. In that sense, I think open source is still letting us down a little bit. So it's maybe not quite enterprise ready when it comes to all the things you want. It searches as well as commercial search, but it's really not the full enterprise package yet. The good news is the open source community, the development in open source search is really accelerating. Probably they're seeing 2 or 3 times more innovation in open source than in commercial, so I think this will probably be something that's solved within the next couple of years. But again, there's no schedule to it. It's what the open source community thinks is important and what they can get around to. Open source is easier to implement. Well, that's kind of a trick too. If you've got very simple case, very simple requirements, there's some open source products you can download and probably use right out of the box. But if you've got a true enterprise application, it's probably In fact, one could say maybe it's even a little more difficult to implement because you're going to be writing some code, and that means you're going to have to figure out what you want to implement, how you're going to implement it, and then do the implementation. Whereas a commercial vendor has probably got a lot of that figured out for you, and your job is to write the application around search. It runs on fewer servers. Well, this is interesting. In a lot of cases, it does. In fact, we had one company we worked with who were looking to expand to a specific, a very narrow vertical requirement in their corporation where they had hundreds of thousands of very small records that needed to be searched, maybe 1,000-byte records. And they went to their commercial vendor, and the commercial vendor said, well, you probably need another 20 or 30 servers. And they really wanted to see if we could do better with open source. We were able to solve the problem with a Lucene project on 3 virtual machines. So essentially, instead of standing up 20 servers that the vendor really wanted to have be physical servers, we could show that we could accomplish the same thing with 3 virtual servers running Lucene. So it's pretty efficient, but it varies widely depending on the need. Open source is not as scalable. That used to be the Dig. It used to be kind of a problem, but in fact, especially the kind of things that Lucid Imagination is doing. Lucid is the company that has taken on the Lucene Solar project and commercialized it. They've added and gone beyond. They call it the ladder. What they try to do is adding features, and of course, as you climb up the ladder goes down. So as they add features, those will eventually get rolled back into Lucene Solar. But right now, they're only available on Lucid's product, Lucid Enterprise Works. But it's pretty darn scalable. You can go just about as far between replication and sharding. Open source is pretty darn good there, so that it's hard to say that it's not as scalable. It's platform neutral. Well, that's a kind of a depends too. The platform neutral part is that most of these products are either C++ or the majority are Java programs. And in that sense, both Java and C++ will run on Windows or Linux or Unix or VMS, wherever you are. The catch is that there are a lot of the tools, especially in Lucene Solar, the tools that are expected or required are actually Linux tools. So on a Windows platform, sometimes it's kind of tough to get those. If you look at some of the tutorials for how to index stuff in Solar, the first thing they'll say is, well, go ahead and run curl and then run ant and then run maven, and you say, well, where can I get those? And some you can't really get, and they don't work quite the same. So whether it's cross-vendor or not is a trick. Commercial vendors, we're seeing a lot of commercial vendors actually leaving the platform neutral area. There's some vendors, Coveo, for example, only runs on Windows. And we've seen some trend toward that, and I think it'll be interesting to see how that progresses as things go forward. Open source doesn't handle security well. I think this is one of those myths that probably has some grounds. Even the Lucid Imagination, they have done some things to add security to Lucene Solar, but even they're working towards some additional security projects. So if security is important to you, you really need to look to make sure that the solution you want to look at can handle that security well, because security isn't something you want to add on after the fact. And by the way, you'd really like to see the security be an early binding. That is, that the security credentials get indexed with the document rather than at runtime, because your search performance could really suffer depending on how many documents you've got and how many people have access to all of your documents. So that's a point where commercial source probably still has the win. Open source has a full support for document format. So that's kind of a push. I think that's a questionable myth, I guess, or got some weight to it. There's an open source product called Tika, T-I-K-A, that in fact has document format, so it can convert Word and Office and PowerPoint and whatnot into a format that can be then indexed. And there are commercial products available. ISIS has a great suite of document formats that are up to date. The problem with the open source formats are that sometimes they don't have the most up-to-date formats. For example, when, let's see, we're currently running on Word right now. If a new version of Word, Word 11, comes out and has a different format, it may be some time before the Tika package has the document formats. I remember seeing a discussion probably a year or two now, year or two ago on a group where a guy had said, hey, I've written these doc formats for the new versions of Office, and I'd really like you to vote for it so it becomes part of the project. Well, if you're using the newest version of Word, you really would like to have somebody not voting to see who's going to do it, and you probably don't want to write it yourself, so you may be looking at either a commercial search vendor or a commercial supplier of formats. Sometimes it's just nice to have somebody to yell at. By the way, that's another thing that commercial wins on. If you've got somebody that you really want to solve your problem or you want a code example on, open source may not be the way to go. Finally, open source saves you money. Well, it does save you money on the licensing part. That was Walter's rationale before, that it's free, but then you're going to spend some money writing the code. It may be you'll spend more money on staff or on writing the code than the commercial product Google would have for you. In some senses, you're a jump ahead. Although I saw recently an Aberdeen study that shows that open source projects are typically half the price of a commercial project. So I'm not sure. That your mileage may vary depending on the requirements that you've got. And finally, open source is a riskier option. It's more risky to pick open source. Back at Lucene Revolution a couple of weeks ago, Paul Dorscher, who's the new CEO of Lucid Imagination, his take at the end of his keynote talk was that, in his belief, with all these companies being acquired and you don't know where it's going to happen, is Oracle going to keep Endeca going? Is IBM going to keep V3 going? His take is actually he believes open source is now the safe decision rather than a commercial product. And quite honestly, your future is in your own hands if you're using open source, because no matter what happens to Lucid Imagination, or even if the Apache Solar project stops tomorrow, you've got the source code and you can make things work. You may or may not want to be in that business, but it's an option if it comes to it. All right, having gone through that, one of the real questions about open source is what skill set do you have in-house and what are you willing to look for? With open source search, you download a project, you'll develop the UI, you'll write customized tools, you might customize some there, and then it's going to be your job to identify, fix, and test bugs and get the fixes rolled out. You're going to become a development shop in-house. You'll need people there who know the tools, know the software, and you may find, a lot of times in companies they'll put people on a project, and then when the project's done, those people will move on. With search, you're probably going to need to bring some of those people back, or a lot of companies will actually work with a trusted partner who can do this for them and be available in the future. We're fans of that because, of course, that's part of the business that we're in, but you have to think about that for your own company and if that's the right thing for you guys. Commercial search, you're going to license a product. You're going to build the UI. You're not going to write code, but you're going to build the UI out of the tools they've got. You'll customize the tools that they've got. You may have to add some pieces here or there depending on how vertical your application is. Then your job is to identify and report bugs and wait for the fixes. So the skill set there, on the left-hand side, open source, you're probably got a Java or a C++ developer, a team to do things like that, project management. Whereas on the commercial search, you're probably going to need some JSP people, maybe some UI developers, but may not really need to have a team of low-level Java developers to be working. With both options, you're going to be providing synonyms and taxonomies. You're going to implement the UI into your existing environment, whether it's something that has to live inside your portal web page or you're going to have it in your own UI. You're responsible for monitoring and managing search, and some of the commercial search products do have a little more tools there. And tuning, measuring, it's so important, I put it down twice. Tuning and measuring is really the critical thing there. You want to tune your engine and then look what happens and tune it again. And then, of course, you also want to evangelize search in the company. One of the good ways to get search working is make sure people know that you're listening and that you're hearing what they say and that you're responding. And that's the evangelizing I'm talking about here. And that's the case for both of those. So here's one thing to consider. There's some chance, especially if you're a Windows shop, you've got some good guys in-house. They're JSP programmers, they're .NET programmers, but there's some tools that open source products tend to expect you to know. And you want to see how much of a specialist you want to have people in-house become. With SVN and Git, which are the two source code control systems that are common there, Ant and Maven, which are, I'm sure all of you know what Ant and Maven do, but those are tools that are generally required or expected in the environment of Solar Lucene. Bash, you want to be a C shell programmer. You're going to be doing some things with shells that, because the command line and a lot of the scripting is what goes into the work that gets done. wget and curl, those are two command line tools that fetch web pages. Some of the Lucid Imagination examples for how to index content in Solar involve loading curl, running curl on URLs and finding out what's going on and then writing your scripts there. If you're comfortable with that, that's great. If it's brand new to you, if it's Greek to you, there's a learning curve you're going to look at. SSH, you're going to need a lot of, to be able to have different processes talking to each other, different trusted processes. XSLT, because you're going to be formatting pages, you're going to be taking XML output and making it look pretty. Then Luke, which is a cool tool for examining the indexes in Solar and Lucene, for example. But Luke is going to be a tool that you're going to have to learn to love. And those are some things that scare off some companies that don't want to have these capabilities in-house for a particular project. So now what I'd like to do here, let's go forward. I want to get into a little bit of the interfaces on some of the open source products. First, in Solar, this is the console. I remember when I first saw it about 4 years ago, I said, oh, so this is the console for Solar. You can see there you can look at the schema, which is where you define the fields and the formatting of the config, analysis, schema browser, setup replication, all the statistics comes from this screen. If this looks good to you, then more power to you. Solar may be the solution for you. But other than that, you're going to need a tool to see what's happening in the search engine that's a little better than this. One of the things that sometimes surprises people, I see I type the word search there in the query string box. What happens when you hit that search is you see this. This is the result list. So for those of you who are good at looking at reading XML on the fly, this is pretty obvious. But for those of you who may want something like, I don't know, a UI that has clicks and links, things like that, obviously some work is going to be needed. Now, all fairness, fast ESP returns the exact same format, just like this. So it's not like it's fast is better, autonomy is better. You're going to get some XML dumps, but this is the way that Solar lets you do test searches. This is what you'll see. Obviously, when you're writing the program for your UI, you're going to take this and process it and use the fields you want, so it generates a nice UI. But this is what comes out of there. If you were to go with someone like Looseworks Enterprise, this is a move forward for search in general. This is their one of their formats that is the and creating a collection, essentially. You actually can now go in with Looseworks, not with Solar, with Looseworks. You go in and type a name of a collection, the starting URL, for example. You want to ignore robots. This is getting closer to, for example, the fast ESP Spider, which was probably one of the best. And we're starting to get that capability, but it's not quite there yet everywhere. This is part of the Looseworks, not part of Solar. Looseworks does have a main console when you log into it. You can see which collections are there, how much documents they've got. You get the REST API, which is how you're going to call it. You see some basic statistics, what kind of search activity you're seeing over a period of time. And then you can go in and edit it. This is a big step forward for open source. It's better than Solar and Lucene have. It's probably not quite what you're looking for. You're probably going to be spending some time working on reporting so you know what's going on. One little bit of trivia there. You know on the bottom of the second collection there's Looseworks logs. One of the things Looseworks does that's very nice is they actually index the logs as you go. So there's always a collection there that has searchable log files. So you can actually look and see what's going on. You don't have to open up a shell and fire up a VI or an editor to find out what you're looking for. You can actually search for it right here, which I think is a nice touch. I don't find that very often. This is a little bit bigger dig. This is the information about a specific collection. You can see what the queries were in the last hour, our most popular queries. You can see some search activity, and then you can get down to the bottom to what the data is and go in and either start calls or schedule calls. So this is a big step forward for open source. It's a jump ahead of Solar, but again, Looseworks licenses their essentially their service on an annual basis. So it's not free in terms of open source. This is another case of the same screen there, entering data. You can have databases or other kinds of sources. In fact, Looseworks has a number of sources here. You can see the kinds of things you can call. They've got an S3 cloud. They've got database, external sites. You can index FTP sites, all these things. And they just, a week or two back, announced a deal to work more closely with Microsoft on Azure. So that'll be an option there as well, I think. So you can see there are a lot of different data sources. You could do all this with Solar, but that's going to take some work. Lucid is probably worth the extra value here. And then this is one more example of drilling down in a particular collection. You can see the history and the settings for a particular collection in Lucid. Search Blocks is another open source product based on Lucene, which is a free download. And it's actually pretty good. In fact, in some ways, it's a little ahead of where Looseworks is. But Search Blocks doesn't specifically come with support. You can call them for help. You can get a license for subscription, but the software itself is free. You can see they've got a lot of sources there too, custom collections, RSS, HTTP. So this is actually a big step forward above Lucene Solar, and it lets you get in and play with it. The one thing that Search Blocks doesn't do yet is it doesn't appear to support any kind of security. So even challenge response doesn't seem to be something it knows how to handle. But it's got pretty good collection creating. The search box itself is customizable, which you can see this is their generic box. You can see what the search results look like. You can click a document and launch it just like a commercial product. Here's the reporting activity. This is some information for the particular collection, what the top queries were, what they were, number of times they happened. So there's, again, the beginning of some administrative reports. And that's about it, I guess. I thought I had one more slide in there for SearchBox. Did not. But SearchBox is a pretty good solution as well. So those are two implementations of Lucene Solar above the kernel that give you a little more room right off the bat. Lucid does support some security. SearchBox does not, but they're both interesting implementations of open source software. So, excuse me, moving into the next realm, I want to look at some indexers and crawlers that you can look at, because everyone says, well, I'll just use Nutch, which is probably the best one. It's an Apache project. I use Nutch to be my crawler. Quite honestly, Nutch was written to be the open source Google. And so in that sense, not only is everything written in shell script, Unix shell scripts or Linux shell scripts, but it assumes that you're going to start crawling and you're going to keep crawling forever. That's often not the case in enterprises. Every now and then I'll run into a company that does that, but there's other times that you want to say, this document needs to get indexed out there now. Let's say if you're searching on your public website and you're involved in a lawsuit, if there's a judgment, you want your spin out there on the top page now. So you can say index it now. Google Search Blind doesn't do that. Fast Autonomy does let you do that. Nutch, it really doesn't. It'll get around to it, just like crawling Google, crawling a public website. There's one called Manifold CF, which is actually an incubator stage at Apache. It's not yet a top-level project. But Manifold is actually a pretty interesting framework for crawling. One of the things it does that I really like is it introduces the concept of an indexing pipeline, which is, you've heard me talk before, you've heard me talk about how great FAST is in that sense. You can actually insert steps to occur during the crawling. So if it crawls and sees a particular page, you can do a look aside to get data from someplace else. And that's pretty flexible. It is an early stage project. It's very interesting. I think it'll be really great as they keep working on it. We looked at that and at Heritrix, which is another project for Spider. We looked at that for some projects we were looking at, and actually I had to go in with a Spider we've got in house called XPOP, which is more specific for what we needed. But those are a couple of pretty decent spiders and crawlers. An interesting thing that's happening is there's some frameworks on this pipeline. I mentioned Manifold has the ability to define different stages. So if I hit a particular page, I want to go and get some other data, or I can take a different route to the crawl based on a page that I find. There's some frameworks that are coming out. A company called FindWise over in Europe just 2 weeks ago introduced their Hydra framework. Hydra is kind of like the FAST pipeline, which is sort of a single stage, single thread, but it has it's multitasking, multi-threaded, so you can have different routes through the framework for different types of documents. So a document comes from the HR repository, go through these processes. If it comes from engineering, go through these processes, and those don't have to be the same. That's really kind of interesting. Hydra is actually on GitHub right now, and I can get you that URL if you're interested. It is an open source project. They're looking for input and they're looking for help. So if you're inclined to do that, it's a really interesting project. Search Technologies, which is a company we work with a lot back in Virginia, they've created a framework called Aspire, which is quite similar. I believe it is not multi-threaded. I could be wrong because I've not worked with it. But in the same way, we're starting to see these frameworks for pipelines because they're so critical to getting things indexed right. So these are some projects and products you might want to look at as you consider open source. Just want to spell out the sources here. This is pretty clearly, some of you know, Lucene, Solar. Lucene, I really wish the Apache folks would just would give Lucene Solar a single name, but there are some subtle differences. Lucene is essentially the low-level API. You submit documents, your API, you'll read bytes, you'll decide when it's a word break. You'll have to do that at the low level. Solar came along and said, okay, look, give us a stream of XML and we'll index it. So it's a higher level API, a little better toolkit, but they're really basically the same API. You can see, in fact, Solar is part of the Lucene project. SearchBox actually took Lucene and went a different thread. They went ahead and put their own UI on top of Lucene, and you saw some of the screens. That's got a pretty good look. Looseworks is actually taking solar and working on top of that. Lucid Imagination was funded a few years ago, I guess, by the CIA and some others to set up a company. Back beginning of this year, they hired Paul Dorsher from XLead to be CEO, and they've made a lot of significant announcements since then, and are actually really pushing on the big data side. Big data is a critical aspect for a lot of companies, and Lucid is focused on that because a lot of people do want to use search on that capability. So open source product you may not have heard of. It's a SourceForge product called Simplexo. That's got some traction. And then Zapier, I have to admit, I've always called it Zapier. And Flax, which is a UK company, we know the guys that run that. That's actually built on Zapier. They will do, however, Zapier or Solar are seen, as I understand it. And those are some implementations that are open source and pretty good. The founders of Flax are actually common participants on the Enterprise Search Professionals group on LinkedIn, and they're pretty good guys, and that's a pretty darn good product. So I'd invite you to consider those different options. Taxonomy tools, these are some tools in general to work with search, because if you're, as I said, the search in Lucene Solar is pretty good, but there are more tools that you may need. Pingar and Wand are two that we're very fond of in terms of taxonomies and entity extraction. Pingar actually does not only taxonomy tools, but also they will do entity extraction, document summarizations for a particular query and document, and actually even type edit. So they've got a suite of tools that are very helpful for enterprise search. Wand are custom-built vertical taxonomies that can integrate with any search technology. In fact, their testing tool is written in Lucene, so it's quite easy to implement those in. One of the questions that often comes up is what languages will content be in? If it's English, clearly it's pretty easy to do. Almost all the commercial engines, at least here in the United States, support English. And in fact, most search platforms around the world will support English. But the trick is when you get into tough languages. You've got a division in Japan. You've got a division in China. You want to enable your search to work on different versions of Chinese or Arabic languages. At that point, you really need to look at some linguistic tools. There are some open source ones, but Basis Technology is actually the company that probably does this better than any. They'll have more non-English language support, and not just pattern matching, but actually linguistic analysis of Chinese and Japanese and different languages that you'll run into depending on how broad your company requirements are. I mentioned ISIS before. They were recently purchased by a division of Lexmark, but I think one of the reasons they bought them is the filters. These are very good commercial quality filters that work with Lucene Solar. The nice thing about them is, unlike going to some of the big guys and saying you want to license their filters, these guys are in the sub $1,000 range if you want to license it for a single site. So it's actually an affordable, high-quality set of filters. And one of the things that's often important to companies I know is like a single point, someone to yell at if it's not working. And when Word 11 or Office 12 comes out, ISIS will have those filters, so you can be pretty sure of that. Categorization, there's an open source tool called Caret Squared. You see that caret up arrow 2 there. That actually is a clustering tool. It actually will pull entities out as clusters, and then you can cluster results. So it's not quite facets, but it gives the illusion of facets, so you can generate some faceted search, what appears to be faceted search with Caret Squared. And then reporting best bets, we have a product called Search Track that we like that lets you look to see what people are looking for, and if a particular term is producing no hits, you can put a suggestion. If a term really should go to someplace that's not showing up, you can say this is the best bet to show up when this particular term is done. So those are some of the products that we've worked with that we liked, and as I say, I can get you in touch with them if anyone would like to know that. So the question is open source ready for you? The answer is it depends. I know that's not great, but there's some indicators I'd like you to consider. One is there are some open source positive indicators. If your staff already knows C Shell and Ant and Maven and Subversion and things like that, that's going to be a pretty big help. If you're comfortable debugging complex software and community-driven software, if one of the things that's notoriously, the internet is sometimes a very unpolite place. If you go out and post something that says, I really don't like the way this is done, does anyone have a sample piece of code to do this? you probably will get a lot of whining and flaming back. You're not going to just be able to say, show me a piece of code that does this like you could with commercial search. If you need something from fast search for SharePoint, you can probably get Microsoft to show you some snippets. If you need precise control over relevancy, if you want to be the one who decides what the relevancy should be, open source, that's a good sign that you might be looking for open source search. It gives you the ultimate control. In Lucene Solo, you can actually have different algorithms for search based on the width of the field. So you could say a 10-byte wide last name field has this relevance algorithm, whereas a 200-byte wide document summary has a different relevancy algorithm. You've got the fine-tuning, but then again, you have to do the fine-tuning. And the other thing is if you want to integrate search, if search is part of a project for you, or if you're going to be trying to serve something that's very, very demanding search, e-commerce or even litigation, you want to deeply integrate search, then that's a sign that open source might be the way for you to go. On the other hand, some indications that commercial search might be better for you. You want the enterprise packaging. You want one size fits all. You want one company that makes the spider, the search engine, the reporting they've got, and what they're doing there works for you. I'm sure you've heard me say before if you've been to one of our webinars, the right search engine for you is the one whose founder did his PhD thesis on data like yours. And if that's in the package that you've got, that's one way to go. Also, commercial is great if you want to pick up the phone and get an answer or get results, get someone jumping. If your commercial software you bought for $500,000 or $800,000 and it's not working, trust me, there's a sales guy who's motivated to get an answer for you, results for you. So that's something you may or may not see in the open source world. The same thing for single source for support, training, consulting. You want to be able to call one person and want to be able to go one place for support, for consulting, whatever. And then in terms of industrial strength, if you've got real industrial strength scalability that's proven and known, a spider that works really well, has all the features, have different Korean, Japanese, Chinese character sets, commercial may be the way to go. And if that's the case, that's a tendency toward commercial search, I think. Okay, well, I think that about does it for this webinar. We're doing another one in 4 or 5 weeks, Managing Enterprise Search, a real-world guide for search managers. We'll be sending out mail about that. You'll hear about that, I'm sure. But I'd like to open up to questions. Chris, what do you have?
All right, I'm right here. So something that came up earlier during the webinar, Otis brought up a couple of things. He asked about LWE. Says it's not open sourced, but it's based on open source, and had the same comment about search blocks. It's not quite open source. It's free, just like some of the IBM solutions. Do you have any comments on that, Miles?
No, I don't. Otis is a pretty sharp guy, an expert in semantic search, and he knows of which he speaks. But I really don't have much more to add, I guess. I hate to say.
All right. So we have another question here from Josie. Do open source projects need bigger staff?
Do open source need bigger staff? That's actually, that's a good question. Open source, you are probably going to be doing some development at first that you wouldn't be doing in the commercial products. But quite honestly, we've seen a wide variety. We're firm believers that smaller staffs can do more. We've been on projects with 15, 20, 30 people, and in fact, we find you spend about a half your time in meetings, and meetings to have meetings, and meetings about meetings, and probably can get just as much done with a dedicated staff of 4 or 5 people and get it done pretty well. So the question, need more, I'm not sure. One thing you will want to have is you want to make sure if you do it in-house or even if you outsource the development, you want to make sure those same team members are available for support ongoing, so that you don't want to lose your guys in-house to another department where you can't get them back if something breaks or something doesn't go right. So in that sense, you probably have a smaller staff, but it's going to last a little longer maybe. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. All right, so I have another question from Evan. Are there any open source search projects written in C#?
Yes, actually, well, C# is obviously a development language in the Windows environment. There are probably, I don't believe I know of any open source products that are written in C#, but almost all of them do have sort of API support for C#, so that you can use Lucene Solar as API and whatever for Windows. Write the code, write the UI, and write the tools in C# and run that on Windows. Again, the caveat is a lot of the built-in tools that you'll find, some of them expect a Unix shell script, so you may need something like SIGWin or MKS Toolkit on your machines to do the development properly.
All right. And the last question we can take, because we're running out of time here. Any special skills required on Solar that are not part of commercial projects, excuse me?
Say that again?
Any special skills required on Solar that are not part of commercial projects?
Okay. I think what that's saying, it sounds like there are some skills, there's some things you're going to need to do with an open source product that you might not do in commercial. For example, you'll be doing lower level coding, I think. Open source is really pretty good, but remember, you're going to be writing, potentially writing an indexer. You're going to be writing the code to prepare data. So there's some lower level stuff that you're going to be writing, and those are skills you might be able to get by with a commercial product without getting to. By the way, let me go back for just a minute, Chris, if we have a second. Otis has asked, I actually got a chance to look over at the questions. He's asking, he pointed out LWE, the Looseworks Enterprise. That is actually not an open source product. It's a commercial product that is sold by Lucid Imagination, but it is based on Solar. And their intent, as I said, their intent is, as they do things in Lucidworks, eventually those will come down into the Solar open source project, but they're going to try to keep ahead of that. So yeah, Lucidworks is not open source. It's a commercial product. What you're really doing is buying support, though. You're licensing support for their annual fee. Sorry. All right. Anything else there?
Nope, I think we're running out of time here, so we should probably let our viewers go. But I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And if you see your screen, our next webinar is on June 27th. So please keep an eye out for an email for our next webinar. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you much. See you next month.